My name is Jesse Trucks. This is a fancy title for a talk because everything should be marketing, right? So I call it future-proofing InfoSec arms race because we have to think about what's the next stage, what's the next plateau. Everything grows, everything changes, and what's the future going to hold for us, and how can we think about that? We've had a lot of talks today about these kinds of things in terms of frameworks and how we can design things now so that they grow with what's in the future. And so what I'm primarily going to talk about today is how our language mirrors military operations and military tactics in information security. And a lot of that actually is from just because of the methodology, and it is really an arms race. That's what I've been calling it for years, and a lot of other people. So I have to do this for my employer, safe harbor statement. I'll make it really short for you. If I say anything about Splunk products or Splunk services, it may or may not be true now or in the future, and we are not in trouble if I say anything that may or may not be true now or in the future. That's a short version of the wall of text, sorry. A little bit about me. I'm the Minister of Magic at Splunk. I'm essentially a security consultant, do some product prototyping and other things, help our customers do security and get better at it. I really like it. It's kind of fun. The other thing is I love data. I love data, and more data. I really like security. It's been a really big passion of mine. I've been doing this about 20 years. A little late start in my career. And I like solving problems. A friend of mine, who's a physicist years ago, said, I asked him, like, why do you do what you do? And he says, because I like solving problems. I want to be challenged. And he said he went to work for Los Alamos for 15 years because they had challenging and interesting problems to solve. And I realized that's true about most of us in IT and security, is we want to pick at that problem. We want to go and fix that problem. And that's definitely describes me. And per suggestion earlier, what do I need? I need more data. I can always use more data. I want to do more analytics on any kind of data set that I can find that involves describing what we do and how we do it in security, because I think that's really important. The input that I would love to have, if any of you are interested, is the application of any kind of language that we use to describe what we're doing. We've talked about modeling and some of the language. Start with 2 or 3 of the talks, actually. I talked about trying to find a commonality of language. We all use the same terms, and we don't always all use them for the same reasons or to mean them, define them in the same ways. I'm curious on how we can work on that. And if we can define that in some fashion, then we can get some sort of a taxonomy that's similar to other sciences, and then we can further debate whether or not that's accurate. And also, my pet peeve, cyber does not mean security. I like to blame this is why I left the US government work, but that's actually not true. I really can't stand that. That's my pet peeve. So, I have no idea why there's a blank. War has been around for literally thousands of years. This is from an Egyptian wall. I think this one's actually roughly 1400 BC, which is sort of when it's been determined has been the first formalized army that's been organized with weapons in Egypt, although before that they had a militia. War has been with us from recorded history and some indications before that, prehistoric, literally 5,000 years. The way war is, and I should back up, this is the beginning of the computers, right? So I'm going to parallel war, like military war, physical war, and computers, right? This is ancient. This is from the 70s. Early on, it was just kind of laissez-faire. Everybody got to do anything. The security was the fact whether or not you had a key to the room, right, largely. And then in terms of real warfare, or physical warfare, the Iron Age changed everything. And that's also a very loaded term. A lot of historians don't like the term. But basically, the time in history when from Eastern Asia all the way through Europe, where mankind figured out how to extract iron ore and do cold forging and tempering the steel. Because at that point, it became cheap, readily available to make piles and piles of weapons. And it was during this time period, which started around 1400 BC in Eastern China, and then ended up around 400 or so BC in Europe, where any nation state or city state could make a massive army or militia. Before that time, very few people could, so you had these massive empires, and this changed everything. And since that time, we've been in a near constant state of war. Nothing's changed. Because today, weapons are still readily available to anyone. You know, you can get a Kalashnikov for like what, $12 or something like that? And then everything changed. This is the Iron Age, the beginning of the Iron Age of computers. Morris Worm. Poor guy. Very famous. In case you don't know, he basically is famous for developing the first internet worm, the first attack software. And at that point in time, people realized that it was incredibly easy to make computerized weapons. And so this is when there's a merging of the language that we use for computer security with military security. This is just a subset of some of the things that we use all the time. We've thrown these terms around all day long. Every day at our office, infiltration, we infiltrate. Military infiltrates. Intrusion, that's when you get into a building or get into a city, et cetera. Lateral movement, that's when you do something where you change sideways around the troops instead of into the troops when you're going around in a military. We call it lateral movement when you go sideways to another system, right? All of these things are used in both, language in both. So let's fast forward to after many, many centuries of various forms of warfare. This is what we call the castle defense, right? You know, castle-based defense. So you have, you start here, you have limited entry points, right? There's basically one place in, so you have a choke point, and then you have guards checking your identity, authorization, you have big walls you can't go over, the moat keeps you from being able to run up to the walls, so it reduces your ability to use ladders and some types of siege engines. You have watchtowers, so you can monitor and observe, you can keep an eye out, and you have inner walls for internal segmentation in case you have a breach, right? Pretty standard. Well, that's exactly what we do on our networks today, right? We have our gateway, we have access controls, we've got an IPS out here, we've got a firewall, maybe a water wall here, right? We have monitoring systems, right? And we even have segmentation. This is every corporate network on the planet who has any kind of security, right, pretty much. And so this is a paradigm that we talk about a lot of times these days. Last few years, people are saying, oh, this paradigm is no longer valid. We've got to do things differently. I disagree. And the reason is because if you want to do security for traditional kinds of attacks, which still happen every day, all day long, you still need these things. You need additional things, which we'll talk about, but you at least need these things. So let's take a break and we'll talk about the kinds of methodologies of attacks, right, in terms of troop movements. It's the same kind of thing that you do electronically, right? So you have a frontal assault, okay? So you've got the people you want to attack, and you have us who want to attack them, or us defending and the attackers, right? They obviously are bad guys, right? So frontal assault, they come straight at you, right? They hit your firewall over and over and over again. You go back, you push back, you put in firewall blocks, et cetera, right? You know, or in troop movements, obviously, you know, we've seen the, you know, walls in the Civil War where you run at each other and everybody dies, right? Then you have a flank assault, where the idea is you go around the side. So you kind of try to work around the front of the troops, and then you go to the side, they're not ready, so you can kind of try to get, you know, generally we're more effective than a frontal assault, less of your troops die, hopefully you win. In terms of computer security, a flank assault basically means, oh yeah, and then of course you push back. What it basically means is you try to sidewalk. Oh, like for instance, I remember at AT&T back in, I can't remember what worm it was. Anyway, it's like late 90s, early 2000s. And we had, it was like the big SQL worm. I'm just blanking on the name of it. Yes, Slammer. So we literally had no infections, nothing. And then through a partner connection, sideways, through a trusted partner, you know, some service vendor, in it came, wiped out building after building after building, right? Or end-round assault. And then you've got a dual flank assault. They come through two partners. You go around both sides. So now it splits your enemy's troops. Now, if you are one-to-one, obviously you're just hoping for surprise and confusion when they're ready for a frontal assault, right? You have to be able to defend about that. So if there are additional ingress points to your infrastructure, whatever those may be, different websites, different partner connections, external internet connections, firewalls, what have you, ensure that you have resources to be able to respond to multiple incidents. And there's a feint and flank assault. This is my favorite. You act like you're going to come in the front, and really you come around the side, right? This is like in so many war movies I've lost count, right? And because what you do when that attack comes at you, you start responding to the frontal assault, and you have nothing left to go to the side. This is commonly used by DDoS attacks today. Somebody burying your front, you're worried about it, you're trying to figure it out, you're working with your DDoS mitigation people, you're trying to figure out how you can stop it, and then suddenly you realize that something's wrong. My wife works for a community college, and I guess about 2 years ago, they were having this massive attack from this Russian botnet, right? Burying their DNS servers, which also, of course, flooded their very small internet connection. And lo and behold, 2 days into this 4-day attack, they realized somebody literally walked into a computer lab, plugged in a USB stick, and infected their network. Because they stopped looking internally, and the very small IT staff was only looking at the external, right? So, fast forward to modern warfare. We have urban warfare. There are no defined front lines. There's enemies everywhere. You have to defend every single soldier, every single place. Well, isn't that what we are today? We're mobile warriors, right? I'm on the road all the time. I work from home. I'm not in a corporate network. I bet you half the people in this room, you do that all the time. Most of us have remote access. We have salespeople. We have technicians. We have administrators, CEOs. Some companies are only remote. So now your attack surface is every single device and every single person using those devices. Like we talked about a framework earlier, the user is an ingress point. So now you have to also monitor the connections between them. So you have to do the traditional castle defense for every single point, and now every single link you have to monitor. And this is an order of magnitude increase in complexity. And so the amount of data, even in a small infrastructure like this shown here, is enormous in a relative sense. So how do you deal with this? We'll take a pause on that and come back to it. So we've talked about the kill chain earlier today. So a paper came out by Lockheed, some folks at Lockheed. The link is very tiny at the bottom here. And this is based on the military concepts of their kill chain in the military is find, fix, track, target, engage, and assess. And you start by finding a target. I forget what exactly fix is. You get a fix, I'm blanking on it right now, but then you track them, you find them, you get to them, you engage them, and then you assess afterwards, right, after action, right? It's the same process that we use this way. So you do reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery is when you drop it on, deliver the actual exploit, and then that exploit explodes and it installs CNC, and then afterwards, right, they can do things. So this is an intrusion model that we are using on a regular basis to describe basically the same thing that happens when SEAL Team 6 goes in and infiltrates an enemy infrastructure. Because you have to figure out what you're attacking. You have to build a custom weapon, and that's what everybody's doing these days, custom weaponization. I saw this all the time when I worked for Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And I see it on a regular basis with my customers, just regular commercial entities in retail, finance, healthcare, and in multiple other verticals, including government. And so then there's custom delivery. You have drive-by downloads. You have watering holes. If you're not familiar with watering holes, that's an interesting concept. You do some sort of ad infection or other drive-by type of thing on a site that is commonly accessed by your target. Good example, the weather page at the local newspaper or the local TV station, because everybody's going to go check it at work before they go home, or they're going to check the traffic report, and then you've infected their infrastructure. Because one of those 200, 300, 3,000 people who click on that or go to that web page is going to have a vulnerable system. At least that's the assumption, right? And so once that's been dropped on the machine, one of them on those hundreds or thousands of systems, in theory, will then actually install the exploit, and then you have a CNC problem, right? So how do we think about responding to this is we have to think like the military. But remember, back here, how much data we're talking about? If you just look at these here, the number of links in between these things and communications, whether they're encrypted through the internet, backhaul, whatever it is, the volume of data is exponential. So how do you do that with a small staff? Because we all have small staff. We have to do data analytics. We have to figure out ways to do mathematical approaches to understanding what's happening in our environment. We have to look at things like the models we talked about earlier and figuring out how to codify those to do machine learning, to understand how to quantify not only the volume of things that are happening, but the specific qualitative and quantitative data using these models. You have to codify these models into math so that you can then respond to them in near real time, because you know real time doesn't exist. And so, because what the military is doing is exactly this. They're looking at things like the intelligence reports that come in, movement, power usage in certain areas and cities. They are doing, of course, surveillance through drones and other means, and they have automated systems looking at the video that's video and images that are coming off of these drones and other systems to analyze what they're seeing, to do some sort of pre-sorting to give the human analysts something to look at and review. And then, of course, they have other systems where they can do this further. And if you look down here, the troops have mobile computers now on the front lines. I almost took a job a number of years ago actually supporting these image systems. And what they're doing is live delivery of intel feeds, satellite images, drone images to the troops on the front line so they have a better chance of surviving and conquering the enemy or just getting through a situation. And all of this is based on doing analytics because the volume of information they're looking at is insane. Imagine flying 5 drones over an area inside of 2 weeks, and now you're supposed to analyze what those movements on the ground mean. They can do a fair amount of this on an automated basis, whereas 5 years ago, a human being would literally have to look at, probably at high speed, every single thing that came in. And it might be 3 weeks late by the time they figure out what they're looking at, where now they're trying to get this down to sometimes within minutes they can respond. So we have to do the same thing with our network infrastructure and our system infrastructure and our data. So, for instance, these are some things, I happen to use Splunk to do these, but this is a 3D scatter plot of a very complicated data set. You can use this to manipulate how the grouping's done, the scaling, so that you can see where there's clusters of things and there's outliers. Like if you work on some of the scaling and some of the filtering here, you might see like this is an outlier and there's a lot here. What's this right here? And those might be command and control, other things like that, depending on what this is doing, right? This is actually a predictive chart. This shows you your confidence interval, and up to the blue line here is the real data that I used, the sample data that I used, and then this is a prediction based on historical values, what it's going to do in the future. And so what you can do is you can do projections. Now I can see what's going to happen in the future, and I can see if what's happening right now looks like what was happening last week, last minute, last year, whatever that time interval is today, Wednesday afternoon, the exact same amount of data or within a certain confidence, one standard deviation, what have you, that would have had exactly the same time of day last Wednesday or not. If it isn't, then there's something wrong, or there's some other event, right? And then here's some example of doing some predictive analysis. You take this kind of data and you can create these other things with it. We all have systems that we can do this with. You can do it with Splunk, obviously. I love doing it in that. You can do it in all kinds of other tons of open source. And if you use these kinds of systems, it is actually relatively trivial compared to what it was a few years ago to use these methodologies without necessarily knowing all the math behind it. The math behind creating this right here is incredibly complex. It's all kinds of statistical models, machine learning things. You don't need to know that if you get a tool that does a lot of that for you. And I strongly urge you to use machine learning on your network, no matter how big or small, the tools are available. Any questions? So, yeah. No, I have not. Yeah, can you say it a little louder so I can record it?
I was asking if you've ever read Vern Paxson and Robinson's paper on why machine learning doesn't work for network security.
For the recording, the question was if I had read a paper that's why machine learning does not work for network security. The answer is no, but could you describe it?
Yeah, so first of all, Vern Paxson is a pretty well-known researcher in the security space. So he has a good amount of credibility when he states that, makes that assertion. But it's largely based on the fact that there's just so many anomalies that if you're trying to do any sort of baseline on network traffic, there's never really a good baseline. So everything looks like an anomaly, and some of the standard machine learning techniques don't seem to work well in that sense. It's not to say that machine learning doesn't have its proper use cases, but I don't know if you can just make a blanket statement that says we'll use machine learning and also solve all your problems.
Oh no, definitely, I agree. Machine learning will not solve all your problems. For instance, you install some sort of behavior analytics software, and it starts baselining. Well, what if you're already infected? So we'll just think that your CNC traffic's normal, and
San Diego's got some new labs. Thinking outside the box, if you apply yesterday's machine learning to today's analytic problems, of course you're going to fail at that problem. So what if you design machine learning for those environments? And that's where a lot of the current research is trying to think differently about what again, buzzword like cognitive or AI, whatever. But with the notion of the target we're going after, as opposed to trying to say, well, I'm going to take what we learned in college and apply it to.
So I think within this community, what I would appreciate more than are those very narrow. Machine learning isn't going to work broadly for everything. It's those very narrow use cases where it's either we design it to be able to work within the context of machine learning, or we find those use cases that are very narrow in scope, and that happens to work really well. Okay, and I think circulating that insight is particularly helpful. Right now, the vendors lock up that insight as part of their proprietary whatever it is, but they're all figuring out the same thing as well and saying, oh wait, this doesn't work and this does, and those things that do work, frankly, aren't that novel so far.
Yeah, two comments I wanted to make is that if you have a chance, go catch the presentation that Alex did. I'm not sure if you remember. Alex, not the one I guess this today, but he has a talk online called Security Cost Math. It's a couple of years old, and it basically goes into a lot of detail why machine learning wouldn't work for the modern security use cases. You have things like high dimensionality of data and so on. And he does refer to the Vern Paxson paper. And just to support Sunil's point, one of the things, it's one thing to do machine learning for network security or enterprise security. I have a little background in fraud detection. Fraud detection is a much more narrow problem, and we see a lot more success with machine learning than the broad network security type of security use case.
And it goes back to the beginning, find the problems. Again,
yes,
it's not about trying to solve network security, but if you look at particular problems where you can create the bound the conditions.
Yep.
The other thing is, I would suggest, and we've seen some really good successes of this, is we have to look outside of our navel gazing on security and network protocols. There's been some really good research on using some of the machine learning and models around genomics and weather modeling, and applying it to security problem spaces, and being able to get the benefits of those other industries, what they've done with the mathematical models in similar problem spaces of tons of data, trying to find that needle in the haystack, or trying to see something that changes only a minor amount across time.
Yeah, one of the problems is, as you two were mentioning, is people think that this is a panacea to just throw it at all of their data. Well, that's not going to work. Yeah, it's not what it does. Just like any other sort of human-driven analytics, you have to drive it. You have to figure out and play with your data and see what models actually work.
Just to start the Q&A, there is one change in schedule you should be aware of. There is a turbo talk going on in about a minute. There was supposed to be nothing going on that track. Now there's a turbo talk on hunting on a mech, in case you were wondering what's going on in the other session. Sorry for stepping in the Q&A.
Okay.
And
Stay here.
everybody leave, William's gonna talk.
So I've seen some work on adversarial machine learning, right? So like Google Maps, you take the numbers 1 to 9, how many pixels do you need to change before the machine reads it as an 8 instead of a 3? And like most of the time, I can't tell the difference, right? Because it knows what the machine learning is doing, and it particularly targets the things to make the machine learning make the wrong choice, because the adversary knows what the machine learning is doing. Have you, since you're talking about a military analogy, have you ever seen something like this where the adversary somehow figures out your decision process and then specifically targets it, especially if it's an automated decision process where you might not notice right away?
Absolutely. I can't talk about specifics, but when I did work for the government, we saw this on a fairly regular basis because government entities have been on for a longer period of time being attacked by crafted, human-driven things. And what we would see in sort of a vague context is we have a variety of totally fatal attacks. Slight increase, but not a lot. We wouldn't realize it was a slight increase until we looked back historically, usually doing some sort of forensics or just hunting, that kind of thing, right? And right after this slight increase of a variety of other kinds of attacks that are fairly mundane, they had figured out what we're looking for, and then those number of attacks would drop, and it seemed normal. And then 3 weeks later, we realized that somebody did get into something, and whatever their interest point was. And so we would see this on a pretty frequent basis. Luckily for us, only once was it really bad. That's all over the news. ORNL closed down for like 2 weeks. It was bad, but highly entertaining because I just started there. But yeah, so this is actually something that's being done on a regular basis. And there are reports that have been done by commercial third parties that talk about nation states that are driving this. We can all guess the 2 or 3 that are doing this. So yes, that is absolutely happening. And in fact, even in a small sort of a vertical microcosm way, Joe McRae, the security guy, he actually at a conference, and I think he's done this online too, live in front of a bunch of federal prosecutors and FBI agents, just pulled up a random site, figured out how to get past their IDS. He just probed it, figured out what it is, spent a whole few minutes banging on it, bam, got right past it. And probably undetected. Why? Because he figured out what it's looking for, and like, oh, that's a Cisco ASA. I know how to get around that. This is a SORM box. I know how to get around that. And so there's a variety. This is why the whole defense in depth thing, if you have 2 different kinds of ways of looking at the same data, then you can avoid that problem more often. But yes, I've definitely seen that in the wild. And I'm imagining it's increasing on a pretty drastic basis at this point. Just computationally, it's stuff easy to do.
This might become a follow-up for a later point anyway, but I'm actually curious about the military conflict model that you're working with that. So I spent some time looking at modeling state consolidation according to like the agrarian conflict theory, basically saying like that states experience control over like the monopoly on legitimate use of violence over a specified area, right? I'm curious, have you looked at similar kind of larger scale models like that, or have you looked into, I know some people have applied maritime law, trying to say, is this law of the sea and hackers are pirates? Like, have you tried to look at any of the kind of like larger meta models around conflict modeling, or have you only looked at it kind of at that lower level of like castle units?
So right now, this is a sort of nascent research of mine. My boss has recently got behind it, and so I'm trying to basically, my whole point about collecting data is I'm looking for data sets that I can do this on, and what I want to start doing is actually doing mathematical modeling and threat modeling on various historic military engagements. By historic, I don't mean like Battle of Gettysburg. I mean like, you know, Iraq and Afghanistan and even Vietnam in modern warfare context. I don't know what those answers may yield. We may discover that it doesn't actually yield anything useful for us, and it may. I suspect that we're going to, like we're talking about, like targeted pieces may. So those are on my list. I haven't done it yet. And one of the things I'd add to that is I want to also do this similar kind of modeling on various, like Russian mafia, the various, you know, what is the ransomware and those kinds of things, how those waves of attacks model using those to see if they actually match. And we have an incredible amount of data available to us through our customers. And I work closely with Verizon, so occasionally they will do me favors to run some models on theirs too. Any others? All right, Matt, thank you.